Deep in the heart of the Amazon basin, hundreds of miles from the nearest major coastline, an impossible silhouette rises above the suffocating jungle canopy. If you were to cut your way through the dense, sprawling vines of the Brazilian rainforest today, you would eventually stumble into a clearing that defies all geographic logic. Standing before you is a towering, rusted American water tower, its steel legs wrapped in thick moss. Beneath it lies a grid of paved sidewalks, the shattered remains of a state-of-the-art medical facility, and rows of decaying Midwestern bungalows that look like they were plucked straight out of a 1920s Michigan suburb and dropped into the wilderness. This is not a mirage. This is the physical remnant of one of the most audacious, expensive, and fundamentally flawed corporate experiments in human history. It was a completely artificial boomtown conceived by a single billionaire who believed that immense wealth and industrial efficiency could bend the ancient forces of nature to his will. If you are fascinated by the hidden mechanics of industrial collapse, the forgotten ruins of corporate empires, and the true cost of unchecked ambition, consider subscribing to follow along as we uncover the lost history of these vanished cities. To understand how a sprawling American suburb ended up rotting in the middle of the equatorial jungle, we have to look at the absolute peak of the automotive revolution. The year was 1928. The Ford Motor Company was not just a business, it was a vertically integrated global empire. At his massive River Rouge complex in Dearborn, Michigan, Henry Ford had achieved total control over almost every raw material required to build his cars. Iron ore arrived from his personal mines in Minnesota. Timber was harvested from his private forests. Coal flowed from his own reserves in Appalachia. Sand was scooped from the Great Lakes to be melted into windshield glass in his own foundries. Raw materials went in one end of the factory, and a finished Model A automobile rolled out the other end just hours later. But there was one critical vulnerability in this closed-loop system. It was a single, irreplaceable resource that Ford did not own, could not manufacture, and desperately needed: rubber. Every single car rolling off the assembly line required roughly 40 pounds of rubber for tires, hoses, gaskets, and valves. At the time, the global supply was held in a stranglehold by a powerful European cartel. Decades earlier, British explorers had quietly removed thousands of rubber tree seeds from Brazil, eventually cultivating massive, highly efficient plantations across their colonies in Southeast Asia. By the 1920s, this monopoly allowed British and Dutch growers to dictate global prices, artificially squeezing the market and sending the cost of raw rubber skyrocketing from pennies to over $1 per pound. For a man whose entire philosophy revolved around self-reliance and cost control, relying on a foreign monopoly was entirely unacceptable. Ford refused to be dependent on anyone. If the British controlled the Asian rubber market, he would simply bypass them entirely by going straight back to the biological source. He would build his own supply chain in the Amazon, the ancestral home of the rubber tree. Through aggressive negotiations, the Ford Motor Company secured a massive land concession from the Brazilian government. It was an astonishing 2.5 million acres of untamed wilderness situated along the banks of the Tapajos River, a major tributary of the Amazon. In exchange for significant tax exemptions and administrative autonomy, the company promised to develop the region and share a fraction of the profits. The paperwork was signed, the land was secured, and the site was officially christened Fordlândia. However, the vision for this tract of land went far beyond a simple agricultural outpost. Ford did not just want a plantation. He intended to build a perfect, industrialized utopia. He believed that the highly regimented, rigidly structured lifestyle he had instituted in his Michigan factories could be exported to any corner of the globe. If assembly line logic could mass-produce an automobile, he reasoned, it could mass-produce a forest. The logistical mobilization required to break ground was staggering. In the summer of 1928, two heavily modified merchant ships, the Lake Ormoc and the Lake Farge, departed the United States packed with thousands of tons of heavy equipment. The manifests were dizzying. The cargo holds contained bulldozers, tractors, pile drivers, and massive steam-powered electricity generators. But they also carried the bizarre components of a predetermined lifestyle: prefabricated door frames, street lamps, fire hydrants, ice-making machines, and thousands of gallons of white paint. Navigating these heavily laden vessels up the winding, shallow waters of the Tapajos River proved exceptionally difficult. When the American managers finally arrived at the heavily forested riverbank, they immediately began clearing the dense canopy to impose their grid. The layout was uncompromising. The planners designed straight, parallel streets that cut harshly through the natural topography. They erected neat rows of identical wooden houses, complete with screened-in porches and perfectly manicured front lawns, utterly ignoring the fact that the jungle soil and torrential rains would instantly wage war against such delicate landscaping. They built a massive, state-of-the-art hospital that rivaled anything found in an American city, fully stocked with the latest surgical equipment and staffed by highly paid physicians. They constructed a power plant, water treatment facilities, providing indoor plumbing, a sawmill, a radio tower, and a town square. Within a remarkably short window, an American industrial suburb had been bolted down into the Amazon basin. To run this massive operation, the company began recruiting thousands of local Brazilian laborers. The initial draw was powerful. The project offered a wage of roughly 37 cents a day, which was exceptionally high for the region, alongside free housing and modern medical care. Hundreds of workers migrated to the settlement, eager to participate in this unprecedented economic boom. But as the workforce settled into their newly constructed bungalows, the reality of the social experiment began to materialize. The executives had imported their machinery, but they had also imported a strict moral and cultural mandate. The settlement was designed to function under the exact same rigid corporate surveillance as a Detroit factory floor, entirely disregarding the profound cultural and environmental differences of the local population. First came the dietary regulations. Instead of the traditional local meals of fish, beans, and fresh tropical fruit, the company cafeterias mandated an American menu. Laborers were served heavy, unfamiliar meals of oatmeal, canned peaches, and brown rice, ingredients shipped thousands of miles from the United States. Then came the social restrictions. Strict prohibition was enforced across the entire settlement. Alcohol was entirely banned, and company inspectors routinely searched workers' homes to ensure compliance. The managers heavily discouraged traditional local music and pastimes, attempting instead to mandate weekly square dancing events as a wholesome alternative, going so far as to build a dedicated dance hall and pipe and traditional Midwestern fiddle music. Perhaps most disruptive of all was the implementation of the industrial time clock. The traditional rhythm of agricultural labor in the region involved working early in the morning and later in the afternoon to avoid the punishing heat of the midday equatorial sun. But the corporate managers, answering directly to an office in Michigan, insisted on a strict 9-to-5 schedule. Sirens wailed across the jungle precisely at shift changes. Laborers were forced to toil in heavy, standardized clothing under a blistering sun, clearing brush and planting seedlings in temperatures that routinely exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The friction was immediate. The company was attempting to force a complex, ancient ecosystem and a distinct local culture into the rigid, uncompromising mold of an American corporation. From the heavily guarded offices of the estate managers, daily reports were wired back to headquarters, projecting confidence and steady progress. Thousands of rubber tree seedlings were being planted into the freshly cleared earth, lined up in perfectly straight, densely packed rows, mimicking the efficiency of a factory assembly line. Yet the entire enterprise rested on a foundational blind spot. The billionaire architect of the city had never consulted a single botanist before launching the project. He had relied entirely on engineers. He assumed the natural world would simply obey the laws of industrial efficiency. But planting millions of identical trees, shoulder to shoulder in the heart of their native ecosystem, was a profound biological miscalculation. A massive, complex chain reaction was quietly brewing in the soil and within the exhausted, deeply frustrated workforce, setting the stage for a spectacular operational crisis. From the claustrophobic, humid confines of the estate manager offices, the sheer scale of the logistical nightmare was becoming impossible to ignore. Picture yourself sitting at a heavy oak desk in an unair-conditioned room near the equator, watching the thick, heavy paper of your accounting ledgers physically warp in the damp air. Outside your window, a seemingly endless wall of green vegetation is actively swallowing the millions of dollars your employer is pouring into the soil. The executives, dispatched from Michigan, had arrived with a profound confidence in their industrial tools. They believed that if a machine could conquer the cold, hard earth of the American Midwest, it could easily tame the Amazon. They were entirely wrong. The heavy equipment shipped south at enormous expense was fundamentally incompatible with the rainforest environment. Massive steel bulldozers and heavy tractors, designed for flat, firm agricultural plains, immediately sank to their axles in the soft, saturated jungle mud. The heavy treads spun uselessly, digging the machines deeper into the earth with every rotation. The dense, ancient root systems of the native trees snapped the blades of mechanical plows like twigs. In the extreme humidity, raw steel parts rusted almost overnight, and replacement components were literally thousands of miles away, requiring weeks of slow river transit to arrive. Unable to rely on their prized mechanical efficiency, the corporate managers were forced to fall back on the very methods they had hoped to avoid: massive, grueling manual labor. Thousands of men were deployed with hand tools to clear the 2.5 million acres of land. It was a brutally slow and wildly expensive pivot. The company was hemorrhaging capital just to carve out a few miles of open ground, and the rainforest fought back relentlessly. The moment a section of land was cleared, fast-growing vines and secondary brush would immediately begin reclaiming the exposed soil. But the real crisis was not happening in the mud. It was developing silently on the underside of the leaves. Consider the fundamental biology of the native rubber tree, known scientifically as Hevea brasiliensis. In its natural, wild state, this tree thrives deep within the diverse canopy of the jungle, but it rarely grows in dense clusters. Wild rubber trees are usually spaced hundreds of feet apart, separated by massive varieties of completely different plant life. This extreme isolation is an evolutionary defense mechanism. The Amazon is home to a highly specialized and deeply destructive fungus known as South American leaf blight. When rubber trees are isolated in the wild, the dense surrounding foliage acts as a physical barrier, preventing the fungal spores from traveling on the wind from one host to another. The engineers who designed this new city entirely ignored this biological reality. Driven by the logic of an assembly line, they ordered the local workforce to plant the new rubber saplings shoulder to shoulder, in perfectly straight, tightly packed rows stretching for miles. They eliminated all the protective secondary vegetation to maximize the yield per acre. By applying factory density to a biological organism, they unknowingly constructed a massive, uninterrupted transmission highway for disease. When the leaf blight inevitably arrived, it swept through the geometric rows with devastating speed. Because there were no other plant species to break the wind or stop the spread, the fungal spores cascaded from tree to tree in a matter of days. The leaves of the prized saplings turned a sickly yellow, withered into gray husks, and dropped to the forest floor. Without leaves to absorb sunlight, the trees stopped producing the valuable latex sap. As if the fungus were not enough, the densely packed, weakened trees essentially became an endless buffet for native insects. Massive swarms of caterpillars and lace bugs descended on the perfectly aligned rows, stripping the remaining foliage bare. Imagine the sheer panic setting in for the site directors. They were watching their primary cash crop essentially vaporize before their eyes, yet they were required to send daily telegraphs back to a corporate boardroom in Michigan that refused to accept failure. Admitting that the core philosophy of the project was fundamentally flawed was a career-ending move. So instead of bringing in local agricultural experts to redesign the plantation, management simply doubled down. They ordered the planting of more trees, poured more chemical treatments into the soil, and tightened their grip on the settlement. If they could not control the biology of the forest, they were determined to control the daily lives of the men working in it. The human element of this corporate experiment was fracturing just as rapidly as the agricultural side. The physical toll of the strict 9-to-5 schedule was pushing the local workforce to their absolute physical limits. The corporate mandate required laborers to work straight through the middle of the day. Between the hours of noon and 3 in the afternoon, the equatorial sun turned the cleared, unshaded plantation rows into an open-air furnace. Men were required to wear heavy, standardized work clothing that trapped the intense heat and humidity against their skin. Reports of severe heat exhaustion and physical collapse became a daily occurrence. The local tradition of resting during the hottest hours of the afternoon to preserve energy was completely outlawed by managers who viewed any deviation from the clock as a sign of laziness. Then came the intense domestic surveillance. The corporate culture of the 1920s heavily emphasized the moral policing of its employees, a concept pioneered in the American factories by specialized corporate sociological departments. This invasive management style was imported directly into the jungle. Company inspectors were assigned to patrol the neat rows of Midwestern-style bungalows, holding clipboards and checking for infractions. They conducted random, unannounced searches of the workers' homes. They checked to ensure no unauthorized local visitors were staying in the company housing. They inspected the domestic cleanliness of the kitchens and heavily enforced the strict ban on all alcohol. Even the yards were scrutinized. The company demanded perfectly manicured front lawns, penalizing workers whose grass grew too high, despite the fact that torrential tropical rains caused the local flora to grow inches in a single day. For the Brazilian laborers, the initial promise of high wages and modern medical care was rapidly losing its appeal. They found themselves living in a highly restrictive, heavily monitored compound, where every aspect of their diet, schedule, and social life was dictated by foreign managers who rarely left their shaded offices. The friction between the rigid corporate oversight and the exhausted workforce was palpable. Consequently, the turnover rate became staggering. Workers would stay just long enough to save a small amount of money before abandoning the settlement entirely, exhausted by the heat and deeply frustrated by the relentless surveillance. To keep the operation running, the company had to spend even more capital aggressively recruiting new men from further down the river, creating a constant, expensive churn of inexperienced labor. By late 1930, the city was operating as a massive, high-pressure sinkhole for corporate wealth. Millions of dollars had been spent, yet the rubber exports were virtually non-existent. The plantation was a graveyard of blighted trees and rusted machinery. In response to the mounting financial losses, the local administrators squeezed the workforce even harder, enforcing the daily regulations with increasing severity to project an illusion of total control. They thought their strict discipline was holding the fragile operation together. They did not realize they were systematically dismantling the last remaining threads of operational stability. The laborers were exhausted, sick, and stripped of their cultural autonomy. The entire settlement had become a tightly coiled spring, waiting for a single, seemingly minor policy shift to release years of accumulated tension. Management believed the greatest threat to their city was the jungle itself, completely blind to the severe civil unrest brewing just outside their office doors. By late December of 1930, the administrative offices operating the plantation were completely disconnected from the reality on the ground. The corporate managers assumed that their strict, unyielding discipline was maintaining order. Instead, they had unknowingly constructed an industrial pressure cooker. The breaking point, as is so often the case in large-scale civil unrest, did not emerge from a massive policy overhaul or a dramatic dispute over daily wages. It started with a remarkably minor, seemingly trivial logistical adjustment inside the company dining hall. Up until this point, the laborers were served their meals at tables by a dedicated waitstaff, offering a brief moment of rest during their exhausting 9-to-5 shifts. But the site administrators, answering to auditors thousands of miles away and constantly searching for new ways to optimize time, decided this process was simply too slow. They ordered the construction of a standardized self-serve cafeteria line. The laborers would now be required to wait in long queues, carry their own metal trays, and have the exact cost of their daily rations automatically calculated and deducted directly from their paychecks. On December 20th, 1930, the exhausted workforce filed into the mess hall after a grueling morning shift under the equatorial sun. When they realized they were expected to stand in yet another line, subjected to yet another heavily monitored corporate process that treated them like components on an assembly line, the accumulated resentment of the past 2 years finally boiled over. A single argument broke out between a floor supervisor and a laborer over the new arrangement. Within seconds, a metal tray was thrown across the room. It was the spark that ignited a massive, uncontrollable civil disturbance. The event would forever be recorded in local historical archives as the Pan Smashers Riot. What began as a localized dispute in the cafeteria rapidly expanded into a full-scale physical rejection of the entire corporate settlement. Hundreds of men, pushed to their absolute physical and mental limits by months of extreme micromanagement and unfamiliar dietary mandates, began systematically dismantling the dining facility. They hurled heavy iron skillets through the expensive imported glass windows. They overturned the long wooden tables, smashed the industrial cooking equipment, and physically tore the meticulously constructed cafeteria line from its floor mounts. Look closely at the architectural layout of the town square to understand how quickly the situation deteriorated. The dining hall sat directly adjacent to the primary administrative and industrial sectors. Once the laborers completely wrecked the mess hall, they poured out into the streets, directing their anger at the ultimate symbols of their daily surveillance. The rioters marched toward the central offices. They hunted down the heavy mechanical time clocks, the very devices used to enforce their highly unnatural blistering afternoon work schedules, and smashed them into pieces. They ripped up the delicate, heavily regulated landscaping and shattered the street lamps that lined the geometric Midwestern-style avenues. Then, the crowd moved toward the settlement's industrial heartbeat, They descended upon the company motor pool and the heavy mechanical sheds. Expensive transport trucks and imported tractors were heavily damaged. Finally, they targeted the massive steam-powered electricity generators. When the rioters managed to compromise the primary power plant, the entire city was instantly plunged into absolute darkness. The relentless mechanical hum that had defined the settlement for 2 years abruptly stopped, replaced by the chaotic sounds of shattering glass and snapping wood echoing against the dense wall of the surrounding jungle. Imagine the profound panic setting in for the American executives at that exact moment. These were corporate accountants, supply chain managers, and site directors who were accustomed to the highly controlled, entirely predictable environment of a Michigan office building. Suddenly, they found themselves completely surrounded, severely outnumbered, and trapped in an unlit clearing hundreds of miles from the nearest coastline. They had no local police force to call upon. They had no immediate physical way to enforce order. Recognizing that the situation had escalated far beyond their control, the site directors made a desperate, chaotic retreat. Under the cover of the pitch-black canopy, the administrative staff abandoned their offices and their perfectly manicured bungalows. They scrambled down the steep, muddy riverbanks toward the docks. Fearing for their personal safety, they piled into rowboats and whatever transport vessels were currently moored at the settlement, including the massive, heavy merchant ships that had originally brought them there. They frantically pushed off the docks, paddling and motoring out into the deep, dark currents of the Tapajos River. They anchored their vessels straight in the middle of the waterway, securing a safe distance from the shoreline. From the decks of their ships, the corporate leadership could only sit in the oppressive tropical heat and watch the glow of the disturbance on shore as their multi-million-dollar utopian experiment was systematically taken apart piece by piece. Stranded on the river, the managers turned to their only remaining lifeline, the ship's wireless radio. They frantically tapped out a high-priority distress signal, bouncing the message hundreds of miles downriver to the nearest major Brazilian port city, begging the regional authorities for immediate state intervention. They reported a total loss of operational control, widespread property damage, and requested armed assistance to reclaim the territory. For several tense days, the executives remained floating in exile while the settlement stayed completely under the control of the local workforce. The vast industrial machinery sat idle. The rigidly enforced schedules were entirely abandoned. When the Brazilian military finally arrived, navigating specialized rivercraft up the winding tributaries, the scene they encountered was staggering. Heavily armed detachments stepped off their transport boats to find the mud-caked streets littered with broken machinery, scattered administrative paperwork, and the physical remnants of a shattered corporate illusion. The military quickly secured the area, dispersing the remaining crowds and officially ending the disturbance. Order was technically restored, but the psychological and operational damage to the enterprise was absolute. When the detailed telegrams outlining the catastrophic property damage and total operational collapse finally reached the massive executive boardroom in Dearborn, Michigan, the silence must have been deafening. The corporate leadership team was forced to sit at their heavy oak tables and confront a brutal set of financial facts. They had poured vast fortunes into clearing the land, importing heavy machinery, building a state-of-the-art medical facility, and constructing an entire suburban grid. Yet they had virtually zero viable rubber to show for it. Their carefully planted trees were succumbing to disease, their heavy equipment was rusting in the mud, and their carefully engineered social structure had completely imploded. According to any standard corporate logic, this was the exact moment to walk away. The fundamental geographic, biological, and social realities of the region had forcefully rejected the American industrial model. Cutting their losses, selling off the remaining scrap metal, and abandoning the ruined bungalows to the encroaching vines would have been the most financially responsible decision a corporate board could possibly make. But this massive global empire was not run by a standard corporate board. It was entirely controlled by a single man whose public identity was built upon the concept of infallible industrial supremacy. To abandon the settlement now would mean publicly admitting to the world and to his fierce international competitors that his core philosophy had failed. He would have to admit that immense wealth and sheer willpower could not, in fact, purchase control over the forces of nature. As the executives reviewed the damage reports from the heavily guarded, debris-covered streets of their Amazonian outpost, a massive, multi-million-dollar decision loomed over the company. They were standing at the edge of one of the greatest sunk-cost fallacies in corporate history. Would the titan of American industry finally accept defeat at the hands of the rainforest? Or would his extreme pride drive him to double down, funneling millions more into a cursed soil that was scientifically guaranteed to reject it. The corporate executives, sitting in the Dearborn boardroom, looked at the shattered financial ledgers from their Amazonian outpost and chose immense stubbornness over basic fiscal logic. By any standard metric of urban planning or industrial agriculture, the project was a catastrophic loss. The initial settlement was heavily damaged. The heavy machinery was rusting into the mud, and the primary cash crop was steadily succumbing to disease. Instead of cutting their losses, admitting defeat, and liquidating their remaining assets, the corporate leadership authorized a massive secondary infusion of capital. They were going to try again. In 1934, the company negotiated a strategic land swap with the Brazilian government. They traded a massive portion of their original failing estate for a new tract of land roughly 30 miles downriver, a location known geographically as Belterra. This new site sat on a high, flat plateau, elevating the operation high above the seasonal floodwaters of the Tapajós River. The soil drainage was significantly better, and the steady river breezes provided a slightly cooler microclimate, mitigating the suffocating dampness that had plagued the first settlement. The corporate logic was simple but staggeringly expensive. If the initial site was a geographical and biological failure, they would simply pack up the remaining viable machinery, float it down the winding waterway, and start the entire utopian experiment over from scratch. Yet, this was not a scaled-down, humbled retreat. It was an astonishing architectural escalation. The company administrators ordered the construction of an even grander urban grid. They essentially copy-pasted the blueprints of an affluent, upper-middle-class Midwestern suburb and bolted it directly onto the jungle plateau. The corporate architects built perfectly aligned rows of pristine, white-painted houses with red shingle roofs and meticulously maintained flower gardens. They constructed a state-of-the-art cinematic theater showing the latest Hollywood releases, a massive recreational clubhouse, heavily manicured golf courses, and miles of underground pipes supplying reliable indoor plumbing to the newly paved streets. Picture yourself standing in the center of this new municipality in the late 1930s. If you looked strictly down the avenue, past the white picket fences and the heavy wooden porches, you would swear you were standing in the middle of a wealthy Michigan neighborhood. It was only when you looked up and saw the towering, dense green wall of the ancient rainforest surrounding the perimeter that the deep psychological disconnect of the architecture became apparent. The executives had learned absolutely nothing about blending into the natural environment. They were still aggressively trying to pave over the wilderness with a heavily manufactured American domesticity. But behind the pristine suburban facade, there was one crucial change in operational protocol. For the first time since the project was conceived, the company finally abandoned its reliance on mechanical engineers and hired professional botanists and plant pathologists. When these specialized biological experts arrived at the new site, they quickly diagnosed the sheer scale of the agricultural disaster and proposed a highly sophisticated, incredibly labor-intensive solution. They initiated a massive tree grafting operation. The process was a logistical marvel, requiring hundreds of local workers to meticulously manipulate the biology of thousands of individual saplings by hand. First, the botanists instructed the workforce to cultivate a sturdy, wild-type Brazilian rootstock. This base native plant naturally possessed a baseline resistance to the endemic soil diseases. Once this foundational tree reached a specific height, laborers carefully sliced the top off the trunk. Onto these fresh, open cuts, they physically bound the buds of highly productive imported rubber trees sourced from Southeast Asia, wrapping the splice tightly to allow the vascular tissues to heal together. Finally, once that fragile graft stabilized, they added a third biological layer, capping the tree with a canopy harvested from a distinctly different rubber variety known to be highly resistant to airborne fungal spores. It was a three-part biological Frankenstein, meticulously assembled tree by tree, acre by acre. For a brief, tantalizing window of time, the corporate ledgers began to reflect a glimmer of hope. The surgically grafted trees actually took root, pushing healthy green shoots up into the humid air. The Midwestern Cinematic Theater played to packed audiences of comfortable administrators, while the carefully engineered saplings slowly matured in the neatly surveyed agricultural blocks. Management sent glowing telegraphs back to headquarters, confident they had finally outsmarted the rainforest. But this brief period of stability was built on a deeply fragile biological illusion. Take a close look at the sheer adaptability of a microscopic organism. By concentrating thousands of genetically identical tree crowns in a single, tightly packed geographical area, the botanists had unwittingly created the perfect evolutionary proving ground. The South American leaf blight did not retreat in the face of the new grafts. It simply adapted. The highly specialized fungal spores mutated over several rapid generations, slowly bypassing the carefully engineered botanical defenses. Because the trees were still planted shoulder to shoulder to maximize industrial yield, the newly mutated fungus had an uninterrupted highway to travel. Within a few short seasons, the dreaded gray withering returned. The mutated spores swept through the supposedly invincible grafted canopies with terrifying, unstoppable speed, systematically stripping the foliage and halting the flow of the highly valuable latex sap. The botanical experts watched in quiet horror as millions of dollars in painstaking manual labor literally turned to dust and dropped to the forest floor. While the estate managers frantically poured more resources into experimental chemical treatments, the global economic landscape shifted violently, rendering the entire botanical struggle entirely irrelevant overnight. The onset of the Second World War in the early 1940s entirely severed the United States from its traditional Asian rubber supply lines. The European cartels that had previously controlled the global market were effectively dismantled by the geopolitical conflict in the Pacific theater. In theory, this catastrophic global shortage should have been the ultimate triumphant validation of the massive South American enterprise. The company held the only major corporately controlled rubber plantation in the Western Hemisphere. Instead, the exact opposite occurred. Faced with a massive, critical wartime shortage of a vital raw material, the United States government funneled staggering amounts of emergency capital into domestic chemical engineering. Industrial chemists, working in heavily subsidized laboratories back in North America, achieved what the botanists in the jungle could not. Within a matter of months, they perfected the mass production of synthetic, petroleum-based rubber. The economic math underlying the entire Amazonian settlement was instantly permanently rewritten. This new synthetic alternative was completely immune to agricultural disease. It did not require a sprawling jungle utopia, millions of dollars in Midwestern architecture, or the heavy surveillance of an exhausted local workforce. It could be manufactured reliably and continuously in massive industrial plants right in the manufacturing heartland of Ohio or Michigan, directly adjacent to the automotive assembly lines. It bypassed the unpredictable variables of weather, soil drainage, and fungal mutation entirely. The massive Amazonian settlements, with their expensive golf courses, paved streets, and thousands of acres of rotting, blighted trees, transitioned from an expensive corporate vanity project into a completely obsolete financial liability in the blink of an eye. The entire foundational premise of the city evaporated. As the reality of this synthetic revolution settled over the boardroom in Dearborn, the corporate overlords began making quiet, highly guarded preparations. The daily telegrams demanding higher yields and stricter domestic surveillance slowly ceased. The shipments of heavy machinery and imported Midwestern foods quietly stopped arriving at the docks. The pristine white bungalows were still standing, and the cinematic theater was still wired for electricity. But the industrial heartbeat of the town was flatlining. The heavily insulated American administrators began packing their personal belongings, securing passage on transport vessels heading back north, fully aware that the financial plug was about to be pulled. But this covert exit strategy completely ignored the thousands of local Brazilian laborers who had spent years conforming to the rigid, artificial economy of the settlement. These workers had abandoned their traditional agricultural livelihoods to maintain this massive corporate grid. Now, as the administrative offices slowly went dark and the imported managers slipped away downriver, the isolated local workforce was left entirely exposed, watching the encroaching jungle vines begin to creep toward the edges of their dying city. By the autumn of 1945, the massive global conflict that had completely rewritten the international supply chain was finally coming to a close. The geopolitical map was being entirely redrawn. Back in the United States, the automotive industry was preparing to pivot from wartime manufacturing back to domestic production. But within the executive boardrooms of the Ford Motor Company in Dearborn, Michigan, a much quieter internal transfer of power was taking place. The aging founder, whose extreme personal stubbornness and uncompromising vision had built an industrial empire, was in rapidly declining health. Control of the company was officially passed to his grandson, Henry Ford II. The new leadership inherited a sprawling, vertically integrated global operation that desperately needed financial restructuring. Henry Ford II was not bound by the ideological pride of his grandfather. He was a strict pragmatist. When he ordered a comprehensive audit of the company's massive portfolio, the corporate accountants finally laid the unvarnished truth about the South American operations on his desk. Take a moment to consider the sheer scale of the financial sinkhole staring back at the new executive team. Over the course of nearly 2 decades, the company had poured an estimated $20 million into the Amazon basin. In today's money, factoring for inflation, that represents an expenditure well into the hundreds of millions. For that staggering sum of capital, the company had built 2 fully functional municipalities, cleared thousands of acres of dense rainforest, imported massive fleets of heavy machinery, and financed highly complex botanical grafting experiments. Yet, the total yield of commercially viable rubber exported back to Michigan over that entire period was effectively zero. With synthetic, petroleum-based alternatives now dominating the manufacturing landscape, the jungle properties possessed absolutely no strategic value. The decision was cold, rapid, and final. The company was going to sever its ties to the region permanently. In late 1945, the corporate attorneys drafted the final divestment paperwork. It was not a strategic market withdrawal. It was a complete, unconditional surrender. The company transferred ownership of the massive land holdings, including both the original settlement and the secondary city of Belterra, directly back to the Brazilian government. The final sale price was a mere $250,000. The corporate empire accepted a loss amounting to roughly 99% of their total investment just to wash their hands of the failure. The immediate logistical reality of this sudden transaction was surreal. When the final administrative directives were wired down to the isolated estate offices, the remaining American managers were instructed to simply walk away. There was no extensive decommissioning process. The cost of loading the heavy infrastructure back onto river transport vessels and shipping it thousands of miles north far outweighed the scrap value of the equipment. The administrators packed their personal suitcases, locked the heavy wooden doors of their perfectly manicured Midwestern bungalows, and walked down to the docks for the last time. They boarded transport ships, drifted out into the deep currents of the Tapajos River, and left behind an entirely intact, fully furnished American suburb sitting silently in the middle of the equatorial wilderness. Consider the sheer volume of high-level industrial and civic infrastructure that was simply abandoned to the elements. Inside the massive, state-of-the-art medical facility, imported surgical theater lights still hung from the ceilings. Expensive dental chairs sat empty in pristine examination rooms. In the heavy industrial zones, massive steam-powered electricity generators rested quietly on their concrete mounts. The warehouses were still stocked with specialized hand tools, spare engine parts, and heavy iron plumbing fixtures. The cinematic theater was fully equipped, complete with complex projection machinery. But a city is not just a collection of empty buildings. The immediate fallout of this corporate retreat fell squarely onto the shoulders of the isolated local workforce. Thousands of Brazilian laborers and their families had completely uprooted their lives to participate in this artificial, heavily subsidized economy. They had moved into the tightly regulated housing grids. They had grown dependent on the imported municipal water systems, the electricity, and the company grocery stores. When the corporate funding evaporated overnight, the foundational lifeblood of the municipality vanished with it. The Brazilian Ministry of Agriculture technically inherited the real estate, but they had absolutely no financial incentive or capital budget to maintain a deeply inefficient Midwestern grid. The massive diesel generators required to pump the indoor plumbing and illuminate the streetlights were staggeringly expensive to fuel. Within a matter of months, the government began severe rationing. The power grid was systematically shut down. The complex water filtration systems were bypassed or abandoned. Without wages, maintenance crews, or basic municipal utilities, a massive exodus began. Families packed whatever they could carry and migrated away from the dying settlements, seeking viable agricultural work elsewhere. Only a fraction of the population remained, choosing to squat in the abandoned architecture of their former employers. This is the exact moment when the rainforest, which had been artificially held at bay by millions of dollars and thousands of hours of grueling manual labor, finally began its slow, inevitable reclamation. If you are an urban historian or an enthusiast of dark tourism, traveling up the winding tributaries of the Amazon to visit these coordinates today offers a profoundly disorienting experience. You are entirely surrounded by one of the most remote, biologically dense environments on the planet. Then, suddenly, a towering steel water tower breaks through the canopy. Its legs are heavily choked with thick, green climbing vines, and the iconic painted logo has long since peeled away, leaving only a canvas of deep, heavy rust. Walking through the primary thoroughfares today feels like stepping into a post-apocalyptic time capsule. The extreme humidity and torrential rains of the equator are highly corrosive. The elements have steadily dismantled the Midwestern illusion piece by piece. The meticulously paved sidewalks have been violently shattered from below, pushed upward by the massive, expanding root systems of kapok and rubber trees. The heavy pine frameworks of the American-style bungalows have been heavily compromised by decades of relentless termite activity and deep wood rot. Look closely at the sprawling industrial sheds that once housed the motor pools and the mechanical sorting lines. The roofs have largely collapsed, exposing the cavernous interiors to the open sky. Heavy steel tractors and imported bulldozers sit exactly where they were parked over 7 decades ago. They are now completely fused to the earth, their heavy treads buried in thick moss, and entire micro-ecosystems of ferns and fungi growing directly out of their rusted engine blocks. The state-of-the-art hospital, once the pride of the corporate administrators, is a haunting hollow shell. The imported glass windows were shattered long ago. Tropical birds nest in the exposed rafters of the former surgical wards. The precise, geometric landscaping that the company inspectors once ruthlessly enforced has been completely swallowed by an impenetrable wall of secondary jungle brush. Yet, perhaps the most striking aspect of the site today is that it is not entirely empty. A small, resilient community of roughly a couple thousand residents still occupies the skeletal remains of the grid. Some live directly inside the decaying upper-class manager mansions, having partitioned the spacious rooms to accommodate multiple families. They navigate the deeply potholed streets on motorcycles, passing by the crumbling facades of the old corporate dance halls and the rusted remnants of fire hydrants that have not seen pressurized water since the 1940s. They subsist primarily on local agriculture and small-scale fishing, completely detached from the global industrial ambitions that originally paved the ground beneath their feet. The site stands today not merely as an abandoned town, but as an enormous physical monument to a very specific kind of economic hubris. The corporate leadership fundamentally believed that extreme wealth was a universal skeleton key. They operated under the strict assumption that the natural world was simply another variable that could be optimized, regulated, and forced into compliance by an assembly line mentality. They assumed that if they imported enough concrete, steel, and Midwestern discipline, the Amazon would eventually yield. Instead, the ecosystem proved that it operates on a timeline and a scale that completely dwarfs human industry. The rainforest did not negotiate. It simply adapted to the intrusive monoculture, deployed specialized biological defenses, and patiently waited for the corporate capital to bleed out. Ultimately, the rusted ruins, slowly dissolving into the muddy banks of the Tapajos River, serve as a permanent, undeniable historical lesson. No matter how vast the corporate empire, no matter how heavily funded the engineering, and no matter how uncompromising the management structure, you cannot force a rigid, artificial utopia upon an environment that possesses the power to outlast you. The jungle reclaims all things,